More than just seriously, it's to be here for the 75th anniversary. I'm going to talk about Second World War bombing decoys, which, as Arthur said, I've written about Dutch decoys, and I'm actually going to be talking for a short while about a dock decoy. So you'll excuse me if my words get slightly confused.
And the real thing.
I'm holograph. And the blackout isn't wonderful, I'm afraid, so I hope you can see the slide. But in some ways, that's quite interesting, because a lot of the decoys rely on not having very good blackout. So this talk will be in. I've got a pointer here. I've nicked the wife's orchid support, so I can point stuff out. So I can only talk for an hour because the orchid is going to collapse. So this talk will be in two parts. The first is going to summarise the various types of bombing decoys that exist or existed, with examples from East Yorkshire. And then the second half, I'll look at a decoy on the North York moors that we surveyed in 2022. There were numerous types of bombing decoys set up at the start of and during the Second World War, specifically for the purpose of diverting German bombers away from their intended targets. They were operated by all three branches of the armed services, depending on where they were located and what they were designed to decoy. For example, the Royal Navy operated a small number of sites around the coast to protect their bases, and the Army decoys were designed to protect ordnance factories and military installations. However, the majority were established to protect airfields, and so were operated by the RAF, and they also controlled a large number of other decoys designed to protect civilian sites, whether they were towns or industrial areas. Britain's bombing decoy programme began in January 1940, and it developed into a complex deception strategy using the four main methods outlined on this slide. Pay attention, because there will be a test. There were four main methods. Essentially, day and nighttime dummy air drones, diversionary fires, sites that simulated urban and industrial lighting, and dummy factories, buildings and other structures. In all, some 839 decoys are recorded for England, built on 602 sites, some sites containing decoys of more than one type. Some 21 decoys have been recorded in the East Riding, although this is likely to be an underestimate, as many have left no trace today. Most can only be identified from wartime aerial photographs and contemporary documents. The decoy strategy was initiated and run by Colonel John Turner of the Air Ministry, and a technical department largely drawn from the film industry, whose staff were familiar with the techniques of specialised lighting and visual effects. Turner was initially involved with the RAF as a civil engineer, and in 1931 became Director of Works and Buildings at the Air Ministry. At the start of the war, he was coaxed out of retirement, and his knowledge as a qualified pilot and of airfield construction and infrastructure meant that he was well placed to run the decoy programme. His organisation, known as Colonel Turner's Department, was part of the Air Ministry and was based at the Shepperton Film Studios in Surrey. He died in 1958, and his contribution to the war effort has only recently been recognised and documented, as much of his work was kept secret. He does not appear to have received any public acknowledgement for his work after the war. The decoy programme represented a significant investment of time and resources, decoys meant that construction costs were relatively low. Nevertheless, several thousand men were employed in operating the various types of decoys, the fortunes of which were closely tied to the targets they served. The whole subject of bombing decoys is, of course, rather complex, and I'm only going to be able to give you a brief outline, a brief summary today. The first types of decoys to be built were designed to protect airfields from aerial attack. These were known as K and Q sites, depending on whether they were to operate during the day or the night. Because at the start of the war, the German threat was considered so great that the aim was to create a decoy for almost every active airfield. The K type, or daytime decoy, consisted of a replica airfield equipped with dummy aircraft. They were created in large fields or open spaces, and occasionally on disused First World War airfields. Mock buildings, fuel stalls, bomb dumps, areas of hard standing, etc. were created. Earthworks were bulldozed to create aircraft pens, and runways were levelled but not always surfaced. All types of dummy aircraft were created out of wood and canvas and mounted on wooden frames or scaffolding. And these were moved around the site by hand, at least daily, to create the impression of activity in case of enemy reconnaissance. Of course, the dummy airfields were designed to be viewed from the air, and usually from fairly high altitudes, such as typically 10,000 feet. And so it was not necessary to provide a lot of detail. For example, aircraft hangars would be simulated by simply laying a large tarpaulin on the ground and painting it to look like a roof. Overall, some 36 K-type decoys were created, but most were closed down in 1942 or 43. The Q-type, or nighttime airfield decoys, arrived slightly later when the Luftwaffe switched to nighttime bombing. These were much more sophisticated and used a series of lights to simulate an active airfield. These lights had a variety of alignments and patterns depending on the airfield they were decoying, but usually involved static lights simulating the different types of runways and approaches. Moving lights were also used, known as hares and rabbits, to simulate aircraft landing and taxiing. The hare was a trolley containing aircraft lights, which was suspended over and held along the runway to simulate an aircraft landing. This used a cordite cartridge. When fired, the trolley reached speeds of up to 60 miles an hour before slowing down as the charge expired and friction took over. The rabbit simulated taxiing aircraft, with front and tail lights again placed in a suspended trolley, powered by electric motor on a loop alignment. A bar of red lights was also placed across the runway here, in case friendly aircraft decided to land, and it was not unusual. This is the effect that they were after. As you can see, the lights there suggesting a runway, and you can also see car headlights and other lights lighting the landscape. As they used electric lights, Q sites obviously needed a manned shelter containing a generator and a control room from which the various lights could be powered and operated. They were placed a short distance away and were either sunken into the ground or protected by a mound of earth. In many cases, the shelters are the only structures to survive to indicate the presence of a decoy site. At the end of the war, landowners were paid to demolish them, but many were kept as they provided useful storage buildings or animal shelters. Overall, some 60 nighttime Q decoys were established, and some occupied the same sites as the daytime K sites. The US Department of Defense reported that airfield decoys in Britain drew at least 440 raids, compared to 430 raids on real targets. It was quoted at the time that more than half the Luftwaffe's exertions were aimed at the projects of Turner's imagination. There were a number of dummy airfields in East Yorkshire. For example, Driffield Airfield had a daytime decoy on the coast at Skipsea. Catchfoss had a combined day and night decoy at Skipsea and nighttime decoys at Dunnington and Beeford, while Pocklington had a nighttime site at Burnley. This 1941 aerial photograph of the Skipsea K site shows grass landing strips, a control tower, an observation tower, and several hard standings, and a barbed wire enclosure around a pillbox. Those remains on the coast have now since fallen to erosion, and the main site is now occupied by the Far Grange Golf Course. So if you're going to play golf at the Far Grange Golf Course, you can mention to the committee that you're looking for the decoy. Moving away now from airfields, I'm briefly going to mention one other specialised type of decoy near Poole. A unique decoy was built on the Humber foreshore between Paulholm and Sherrycock Sands on an area of salting known as the Outstray. It was designed to replicate the docks located in the city of Hull, some 10 kilometres further to the northwest. The instigation for the decoy occurred in the spring and summer of 1941, when the port was specifically targeted and some 450 people were killed. The decoy was built at 1/3 scale and operated by the Royal Navy. The main decoy simulates the King George and Alexandra docks, down here lying either side of the Holden Estuary. Further to the northwest, the foreshore narrows so that the representation of the dry pool and the other docks was more limited. The decoy was extremely simple. It used static lights to mimic those which would have been visible during the nighttime blackout. This is known as permitted lighting, which would have been allowed to have been kept on so that the dock could still operate. A series of lights were mounted on 3-metre-high poles so they could shine on water, which in most cases was contained in specially constructed and shaped concrete ponds. Together, these form a display, which when viewed from a high altitude appeared to be the lights outlining the individual docks. Here is a plan showing the arrangements, and here is the outline of, for example, the King George dock. I've put that on so you can see it. Of course, it was 3 types of ponds were actually constructed. Rectangular ones representing the lights on the sides of the docks, right-angled triangular ones representing the internal angles, and 5-sided ones representing the dock entrances. Of course, it was important that the decoy reflected the actual topography of the docks, and so 3 other rectangular ponds in a north-south line were dug to recreate the course of the Holden Estuary. This is now audience participation. here's a Google Earth image of the King George dock, which remains the best preserved and is represented by 16 concrete ponds. Can you see any of them? If you look for small rectangular shapes within the otherwise fairly random arrangement, there's a corner, triangular pond there, another straight one there. Here's the ones doing the Holderness drain. I'll tell you what, there, I'll put that on for you. Just to the west of the Little Humber Farm, there's a pair of drains, as can be seen on the lower image. Unlike most of the others, they are not straight. These are historic features, the northern one being the former Paul Holm Creek, and the southern one being a 19th century floodbank. During the operation of the decoy, the drains were dammed and the area between was flooded to recreate or mimic the course of the River Hull between the other two drains. Here are the remains of the King George decoy as it survived in 2015. You can see the poles from which the lights were suspended over the concrete ponds. The night shelter from where the decoy lights were operated lies near Little Humber Farm. It had two rooms either side of an entrance protected by a glass wall. One room contained diesel powered generators and the associated switchgear, and the other room, which had an emergency escape hatch through the roof, was the accommodation for the decoy's crew and the bomb shelter. So we've looked at aerodromes. We're now the decoys that we've looked at so far all involve the use of lighting to create an illusion. But the other main type of decoys involve deliberately setting fire to something. These were designed to simulate a potential target which had already been hit by pathfinders or a first wave of bombers, and the aim was to attract other bombers to it and away from their intended targets. These decoys are known as diversionary fires, and there were two main types, QF and SF sites. The main difference between the two being the scale of the site and the range and types of fire displays. QF sites were generally smaller and represented specific target locations, whereas the SF, or starfish sites as they're called, represented towns and cities. For both types of these decoys to be successful, it was essential that they replicated the type of fire effects an enemy aircrew would expect to see when bombing a particular target. The decoy displays therefore included variations in the type of fire, the duration of burning, and the speed of ignition, and they were contained within discrete areas defined by fire break trenches. The fires themselves were activated and controlled from a remote shelter. I'm going to look at the SF starfish sites in a bit more detail, because to be honest they're a bit more exciting. Nationally, by the end of January 41, the number of starfish decoys had risen to 43, covering 13 cities. But by April of the same year, the number was 130, covering a total of 42 target towns. For obvious reasons, they were built in open, sparsely populated rural locations. The basic operation of a starfish site involved various types of fire-producing equipment, grouped together in different fire groups, which were electronically ignited by cabling from a control shelter in order to replicate the effect of incendiaries dropped from the start of the range. An essential part of the design was to isolate one fire group from another, and so trenches were dug around each fire break to prevent fire escaping and configuring the whole site. As you can see from this slide, on this slide, 4 main types of apparatus were used to create the fire and the illusion: boiling oil, grid and coal, plain coal fires, and groups of basket fires. We're going to look at, briefly look at one or two of these examples. The boiling fire, you can see they're a bit Heath Robinson, aren't they? The boiling fire apparatus involved feeding diesel or gas oil into metal troughs which contained burning coal, which was initially heated and fired electronically. The fire burned through a cable which opened a valve up to the oil tank, which spilled 66 gallons onto the flames with obvious effect. When water was added, there was a violent and explosive fire burst. Each starfish site typically had 12 to 14 boiling oil fire equipment, and tank capacities of 480 gallons of oil and 20 gallons of water meant that a burn could be maintained for up to 4 hours. The coal drip fire apparatus was similar, consisted of a single or double brazier made from scaffolding supporting a metal tray with igniters below. Coals were burnt in one or more of these long thin braziers, and a 36-foot long feed pipe from a tank dripped diesel oil onto the coals to provide violent sudden explosions against the general background burn. This simulated small eruptions, such as an exploding gas canister, or fuel stalls, or similar. The final method was to use individual basket fires. These utilised small square crates, raised above the ground on a stand, lined with wire netting and filled with layers of flammable and inexpensive materials. Flare cans filled with creosote were attached to the sides for greater effect. This was by far and away the most common type of fire mechanism, and the baskets were usually placed in clusters of 8, 16 or 24 to simulate densely packed buildings. In this case, burning was limited to about an hour, meaning that a sequence of firing episodes using baskets in other fire groups was needed to maintain the 4-hour burn. Crucial to the operation of a starfish decoy was the night control shelter. These are almost all above ground structures, as pre-1941 examples were found to be susceptible to flooding. The design drawing for the starfish shelter was produced by the Air Ministry sometime in 1941. Don't tell anyone about it. Essentially, it's a brick or concrete walled rectangle with a concrete roof. The walls were constructed in brick or precast concrete hollow blocks filled with sand, and the roof was covered with a reinforced steel fabric. There was a single entrance here, protected by a 7-foot high blast wall, as you can see here. The internal space measured 10 foot by 8 foot by 7 foot high and housed the igniter, switchgear and the communications equipment, with a generator to power the electrical circuits and switches that activated the fire groups, either singly or in rotation. It had various air vents and a soakaway channel for drainage, and also an emergency exit through the roof, which could be accessed by step irons placed in the wall below. The whole structure was surrounded by earth banking for blast protection. The basic method of operation was to run cables from the individual fire groups to the shelter, which housed the telephone, which received the orders to ignite, and the switchgear, which activated the various types in the decoy. The shelters were placed at some distance from the fire groups for obvious reasons, in some cases more than several hundred yards. The electrical engineering involved was very complicated and required constant maintenance. We recently did some work for the North York Moors National Park on the Osmotherley starfish site. This was one of a number of decoys built on the north side of the moors to divert enemy bombers from the important chemical and iron and steel work centres in Middlesbrough, some 12 miles to the north. Day-to-day operation was provided by RAF Thornaby, and it was manned by one RAF corporal and 6 other airmen, including a driver and an electrician, who were all billeted at the nearby farm. It seems to have been operational between August 41 and April 43, and it differs from the other starfish sites in that only basket fires were used. You can see on this plan, here's the main decoy site, and you can see the command bunker is some 400 metres away. Now the method of operation, as I said, was to run cables from the shelter to the decoys, but these were often just simply laid on the ground, and anecdotal evidence from this site suggests that there needed to be constant supervision because the cabling kept being eaten by the sheep. Little can be now seen of the fire groups, but the brick-built control shelter, which conforms very closely to the 1941 design, still survives. But as you can see, the surrounding earth banks have been removed, as had all the internal fittings. There was also a separate Nissen hut for the crew next to the shelter, the concrete base of which remains. In East Yorkshire, Hull was protected by 4 starfish sites, located at Gansted, Bilton, Poole and Aldborough. They were all built in 1941 or soon after, and all are closed by February 45. Nothing now remains at the sites, with the land having been turned back to agricultural or other uses. But there is this 1945 aerial photo of the Aldborough decoy, and you can see the fire groups and all the various types of equipment and so on inside. It's generally considered that the starfish decoys in particular, compared to other types of decoys, were successful in diverting enemy bombers away from their primary targets, and thus saving many lives. For example, on one night in April 41, the starfish site at Sinner Common drew 170 high explosive bombs and 26 parachute bombs away from Portsmouth, representing 95% of the total weight of explosives dropped during that attack. The sites protecting Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol, Middlesbrough and the Humber Estuary were considered to be the most effective. Overall, it's been estimated that some 2,500 civilian lives were saved, and countless buildings, equipment and other facilities. I quite like this picture here, showing the remains of an unidentified starfish site. But this was obviously bombed, it obviously worked. You can see the chap standing inside the bomb crater. There was a particular concentration of decoys around Paul and along the Humber estuary to protect the industrial complexes on both sides of the river. The German bombers tended to use the estuary for navigation, and these decoys were used to make them think that they were further inland than they actually were. We've already seen the decoy docks, but there was also one or possibly two starfish sites, as well as an oil-fired QF site up here. This is another one of those rather more specialised types of decoy, which I'm just going to show you a few slides of because they're rather special. This one at near Paul was built by the Petroleum Board in 1941, and it was designed to deflect enemy bombing away from the oil refinery at Saltane. Fuel oil was fed from boiling fire apparatus into specially constructed pools and channels, lined with brick or clay and filled with wood shavings, so that when fired and seen from the air, they replicated a bomb or burning oil refinery. Typically, each site contained a circular oil ring, a concentric or semicircular pond, and a more regular pond. As with the starfish sites, this decoy was ignited from a remote shelter, which still survives on the edge of the Humber, alongside another which relates to the adjacent starfish site. Unfortunately, nothing of the actual decoy now remains, but again, it can just be made out on this 1942 aerial photograph, and this is a representation of what you can see on the aerial photograph. Here's the oil decoy with its circular pond and other ponds, and here is the starfish site. These features representing the collections of basket fires and other things that we've already seen. This lies just to the southeast of Bullhorn Town. So I'm now going to talk about QL decoys. This is the bit you've all been waiting for, QL decoys, with reference to one that we surveyed in 2022. Like starfish decoys, QLs were sighted in clusters with a dozen or more decoys protecting the larger towns and cities. QL stands for Ports Light. QL decoys were first operational in August 41, and they reached a peak in December 42 when 209 were active. Most were decoying non-military targets, the majority of which lay in the industrial Midlands and the North, with other concentrations on the Tyne and the Tees and the Bristol and Avonmouth areas. For obvious reasons, the QL decoys relied on diversity to retain realism, and no two were the same. Standard layouts were explicitly avoided, and sophisticated light displays were covered areas of between 5 and 30 acres in extent, the size depending on the target it was intended to decoy. In essence, QL sites were designed to give the appearance of a variety of targets, displaying permitted and illegal lighting and poor blackout adherence, in contrast to the other decoys that we've seen so far, which use fire to simulate bomb damage. Many, although not all, of the QL sites were co-located with the starfish decoys, and their night shelters and ancillary structures were often shared. This dual operation meant that the QL decoy would draw the bombs, and then as they fell on or around the target, the starfish would be lit to give the impression of fires having already been started, and thus attracting more bombers. Very little now survives of any of these sites, most having been cleared away after the war. Although, as we've seen on the other types of decoys, some control shelters remain. These images give you an idea of the type of apparatus likely to be found on a QL site. As I said, a typical QL decoy would simulate a town or city with dim street lighting, escaping lights from open doors and skylights, and flashes from tram wires, or an industrial complex with its permitted lighting, such as glows from furnaces, factories, docks and marshalling yards, or in some cases the combination of both. It was obviously important that the decoy was laid out in a similar pattern to what the enemy pilots were expecting to see over the actual target, and we've already seen this at the Hull dock decoys. The equipment used to achieve these lighting effects comprised a range of simple devices, often deceptively so. Most were freestanding above the ground, and so once cleared away after the war would leave little surface evidence behind. Some of the lighting devices were the actual article. For example, shielded lights placed on poles to mimic a railway marshalling yard, or a set of vehicle headlights contributing to blackouts of poor blackout conditions. However, many devices were specifically designed and created by Colonel Turner's department, and they have the appearance of Heath Robinson constructions. In decoys simulating industrial complexes, for example, the presence of coking ovens was imitated by furnace globes, where a tray of sand was laid down a few metres across with red and yellow lights suspended above it, shining down onto the sand to create a dim glow. And you can see on the right-hand side the effect that was able to be achieved. Many QL sites were built to replicate poor blackout conditions in residential areas. This was known as leaky lighting. The apparatus used here were in some ways the most ingenious decoys of the war, and were the most simplistic and varied. More general lighting was achieved using reed lights or hurdle lights, where wicker was just simply placed over domestic light bulbs of varying intensity, while jinx lights, where a hooded lamp was swung over a trail of water to create a flickering light. I mentioned Heath Robinson and inexpensive materials. You can see that this jinx light was actually suspended by a twig. Box lights at the top there were used to simulate dirty windows, which threw a diffuse light in one direction. Other constructions using a wooden frame covered with chicken wire and scrim mimicked an open door left ajar, or a skylight not using the correct blackout material. The most elaborate examples were the electrical tram flashes for towns and riveting fires for industrial sites. Both of these relied on sudden bursts of lights from carbon arc lamps controlled by randomly closing a switch. Each decoy also used some bright lights to attract the enemy from a considerable distance away, which were then turned off, and less bright lights or dim lights were then turned on that were only going to be visible on approach. Moonlight and weather conditions were also taken into account. For example, if a display was intended to replicate permitted factory lighting, it would not be effective in bright moonlight, as the pilots and bomb aimers would be able to see enough of the decoy to note the absence of buildings and yards. And this image illustrates that perfectly. You can see that this decoy marshalling yard is clearly laid out over an agricultural landscape. As with the other types of decoys, there was a standard design for the control shelter. It comprised an upstanding earth-bank building resting on a concrete raft with a concrete roof. Internally, the building was divided into two rooms. The control room contained the switchgear, stove and communications equipment, while the engine room housed 3 generators linked to a system of external expansion chambers. As with the starfish shelters, there was a central entrance around the ground level, shielded by an external blast wall and a roof hatch for escape purposes. Many shelters now survive in varying conditions, but if you're looking for an interesting place to go in Wales, one has actually been converted to holiday accommodation. My wife isn't very impressed when I said we could go there. The decoy that we surveyed is located on the northern parts of Fylingdale's Low Moor, on the west side of the A171 Whitby to Scarborough. Like many decoys, the site is associated with the starfish site, although in this case the two were physically separate. This is our decoy site, QF's decoy site here. In our site, a number of different types of small but well-preserved earthworks were identified within the detailed area of survey in red. The rest of the site to the north, shown in green, which we walked over, was covered with heather, and recognition here was much more difficult. This slide also shows the locations of the control shelters. The control shelter for this QL decoy is here, whereas the shelter for the starfish decoy is right up here, over a kilometre away. Can you imagine laying cables for that distance through the countryside? The Sneetham Moor starfish site is relatively well known and comprises 9 banked fire groups enclosures within which were placed the variety of baskets and other apparatus that we've already seen. You'll now be familiar with the sort of layout. This site was used in conjunction with the other starfish decoys at Gisborough, Osmotherley, Middleton, Kirkleatham and Newton Bewley, all on the edge of the North York Moors, to decoy the industrial complexes in Middlesbrough. This site was probably used in December 43, and it was decommissioned in the following year. The area was then used for military training in the build-up to the D-Day landings. Hence, all these tank tracks crossing the site. The starfish decoy shows up quite clearly on this 1943 aerial photograph, but nothing can be seen of our QL decoy. But this photo is also interesting in that it shows a lot of bomb craters, suggesting that this site was pretty good in attracting enemy bombers. These are the earthworks that we recognise within our QL site. There's W-shaped trenches, typically 6 to 8 metres long, but others were rectangular pits, up to 3 metres square, with shallow arms running off at right angles from one corner. There were various other pits or depressions which were more oval or circular, and some had spoil around them. As you can see, the earthworks are quite small and shallow and could easily be missed. There's one of those rectangular pits with the right angle trench running off, and similarly another one here. As I mentioned before, the problem with this type of site is that they do not conform to a standard design, and even the individual elements within them are not the same from one site to another. But we believe that the W trenches represented open door simulations, where a single light bulb with a flat roof above and slightly open at one end would imitate a partially open door. The larger square pits with short sections of right-angled trenches might have housed the wooden frames for those open skylights that we saw. We assumed that the angled trenches were dug so the cables could connect the apparatus with the control shelter. But of course they could also be used for personnel crawling in to maintain the equipment. The shallow type E pits, which are really just slight depressions in the ground, could represent water-filled holes with lights suspended over them to create a reflection of shielded street lighting on a wet night, for example. But when all these features were put together, it showed that the earthworks were actually laid out in a series of north-south lines. And within these lines, the various types of earthworks were generally mixed up. Although, for example, there was a central line of these zigzaggy W trenches here, which might be the open doors. And it's also interesting to see that those very shallow depressions in grey here were in straight lines, which is why we thought they might be representing street lighting. The more purpley coloured, bigger depressions down the bottom may actually be bomb craters, suggesting that the site was actually bombed. As I said before, these decoys were shadowing the industrial complexes on Teesside. And one area of housing with north-south aligned streets formerly lay in the St Hilda's area of Middlesbrough, on the south side of the River Tees, with several large ironworks located to their immediate northwest. So, although it's pure speculation on my part, perhaps the QL site was imitating this area of housing, while the main Starfish site was mimicking the complex of the ironworks. This would explain the relative locations of the QL and SF decoys on Sneaton Moor. So, in conclusion, the Sneaton Moor site remains a very important and rare survival. Other QL sites containing more permanent or extensive structures are known about, but not in the level of detail that we were able to achieve here. And as we've seen on many sites, only the control shelters survive. And of course, we've only recorded the earthworks. Many of the remains would have consisted of simple timber and metal structures, isolated poles, and so on, evidence for which would not survive above the ground. And finally, you will have noticed that the earthworks of this QL site are relatively small and shallow. These are often impossible to recognise in Heather Moorland, where most of the bombing decoys on the North York Moors are located. But elsewhere in East Yorkshire, for example, nothing now remains of these actual sites, the land having been returned to agriculture. So I hope that that's given you a very basic outline of the types of bombing decoys that were set up during the war, and those which survived were located in East Yorkshire. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Well, I'm not happy. I will try to answer any questions that any of you might have. And if I can just preempt the first question, which is what everyone always asks me, was, did the Germans do the same? And there we are. A German decoy airfield with its aircraft being constructed of wood and what have you, somewhere in the Netherlands. And I really like this story because the RAF knew all about it. They watched it being built. And when it was finished, a lone bomber went over and dropped a wooden bomb. To show that we know what's going on. Right, are there any more other questions?
They seem to have a short life.
Yes.
Is that because of when bombing was taking place?
Yes, yeah, they started basically in 41 and were all cleared away in 45. Yeah, because the land needed to come back to agriculture, or in the case of the wars, shooting and so on and so on. So they didn't, and of course the nature of many of these sites, it didn't take much to clear them away. It's not like an area of mines or something which had to be physically cleared in some way. You could just lift them all up and take them away. So they didn't last long at all. Which as an archaeologist is a bit frustrating because I'm used to dealing with thousands of years, not 5.
There's nothing more unreliable than human memory, but I had a friend, now deceased, who in his teens lived in Gilberdike, and he said that there was a lot of decoy at Gilberdike,
Yes.
including, he believed, another replica of Hull Docks.
Oh, right.
But, as I said, there is nothing more unreliable than human memory.
Yes, I haven't heard that. I would be surprised
So,
because the precept of the ducks was the Victorian River Gate. But there may well have been some sort of decoy in that area. I only just sort of briefly went over it, and as this gentleman said, the fact that they were clear so fast and the documentation is fairly limited. You know, it took, you could see when they were building the same with the German and the British planes, you could build 10 in a day. You know, so it didn't take long to build and take these things down. And there's virtually no records at all anymore, really. The records will say there was a starfish site at Osmond, but it won't tell you how many times it was fired, how successful it was, and all that sort of thing.
well, it is just that, you know, he was there.
Yes, yes.
He said he was there.
No, but it may, I doubt if it was a dox, but it may. Could well have been, yes, because that's an inline port, as it were, yes. Yeah, it could well have been. I've not heard of it, but that would be anything. And it could well have been there, yeah.
What particular groups of men were actually employed in manning them? Did it include the Home Guards?
No, it was all, well, I'm trying not to be disrespectful to the Home Guard, but they were all active servicemen, being that were operated, like that one at Osmotherley I mentioned, 5 minutes, that I mentioned. I mean, you can think, I'm not sure the Osmotherley one was actually bombed or even set alight. I think it must have been, but you can imagine